So welcome. I'm Glenn Cohen. I'm the faculty director for the Petrie Flom Center. We're really glad you could join us today. It was going to be a fantastic event. I'm going to introduce Einar Elhaug, who in turn is going to introduce our guest. Einar is the Petrie Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He is the founding director of the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. He also served as chairman of the Antitrust Advisory Committee to Obama campaign. He teaches a gamut of courses from antitrust to contracts, corporations, legislation, and healthcare law. I make it my ambition to be good at one thing. Einar makes it his ambition, and more importantly, his success, to be good at basically everything he does, right, including boating, but that's another thing entirely. He has casebooks in a myriad of subjects, including antitrust law, contract law, legislation, regulation, and has written some of the best books in healthcare as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Einar, who's going to introduce our guest. Thank you very much, Einar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Glenn. So we're very pleased today to have Bill Schultz, a partner at Zucker Spader. Before that, he served for 6 years in the Obama administration as general counsel to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And he is here to talk about the Affordable Care Act, past, present, and future, which is great timing because at present the future is very unclear, it seems to me. I was writing these introductory comments, and I was start out with one, because tonight the House vote is scheduled, which was quickly followed by, it's reported that the House Freedom Caucus has rejected Trump's final offer, which was quickly followed by Sean Spicer saying that nothing led him to believe that tonight's House vote would be canceled, which of course was quickly followed by the news that tonight's House vote is indeed canceled. So they're not voting tonight, and it also seems unclear at present whether anything that can get through the House and Freedom Caucus, if that's possible at all, whether if it does get through, it could get through the Senate, which I think seems increasingly unlikely because the regulatory changes demanded by the House Freedom Caucus would seem to mean that you can't go through the reconciliation process, and thus you need 60 votes in the Senate. So it's a time of enormous flux and uncertainty, so a great time to hear from a real expert on the topic to find out what's at stake and what he predicts.
Thank you, Einar. And I must say, I think the law school is really fortunate to have this center. I've looked at the website, and you've got every big topic there in some kind of detail, and I'm sure professors watching it very closely. As Einar says, and as everybody in this room knows, today is the 7th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. And it's also the day that the House leadership scheduled to vote on a bill that would essentially repeal the Affordable Care Act. That the House leadership picked today as the day to do the repeal is demonstration of how divisive this issue is. In fact, national health care has been one of the most divisive issues of our time. Take the Affordable Care Act. Supporters say that it's been a remarkable success. 20 to 20 million people insured as a result of it. The consideration of pre-existing conditions out the window. That means if you're sick, you can't be denied health care. You can't even be charged more because you're sick. It's real insurance, not skinny insurance plans. And there are lots of other benefits. Kids under 26 can stay on their parents' plan. There are no lifetime limits. There are no co-pays for preventive services like vaccine and contraception. Lower premium increases than in recent years. It extended the Medicare Trust Fund for 10 years. Its opponents say it's a disaster. As the Speaker of the House would say, a national nightmare. They call it Obamacare. They say there have been unsustainable premium increases. They say it forces people to buy insurance against their will, and it forces them to buy more insurance than they want. They sum it up by saying this is big government at its worst. It's another large program where the feds are controlling a major segment of the economy and denying the states any real role. How did we get here, and where are we going? Well, it's been a long road, and starts more than 70 years ago. In 1946, President Harry Truman proposed national health care. It was proposed again by Presidents Nixon and President Carter. In the meantime, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson was successful in enacting Medicaid and Medicare, which was health care for the elderly, the disabled, and some of the poor. But national health care really didn't have any legs until 1993, when President Bill Clinton decided to make it his #1 priority. In his first days of office, he announced the formation of the Health Care Task Force, which eventually grew to 500 people, to be headed by his wife, Hillary Clinton, and tasked with drafting the legislation. After a long process, it takes 500 people a long time to do anything, they develop a bill, and the basic idea was an employer mandate. Employers have to provide health insurance, and others would buy it separately with subsidies for the poor. The bill was promptly opposed by every major important business group. It was opposed by the American Health Insurers Association, the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association, PhRMA, the lobbyists for the drug companies, and many other business interest groups. The Democrats had the majority in the House and the Senate. They went through hearings, they went through markups, but by the summer of 1994, it was pretty clear this wasn't going to work. The bill was stalled, and ultimately it crashed and died. Then came the fall elections in November, the congressional election, and Clinton paid the price. In the Senate, he lost 8 seats, and he lost the Democratic majority, which he was never able to regain. The House results were even worse. He lost 54 seats in the House and Democratic control for the first time in 40 years. I was a House staffer at the time, and I can tell you this was beyond what anybody thought possible. Many House staffers thought they were there for their careers. I think Democrat and Republican, it was hard to imagine the House turning over to the Republicans, and yet it did it in dramatic fashion. Many thought this would cost Clinton his presidency. It didn't, but it crippled it. He never regained either the House or the Senate. He suffered from 6 years of oversight. He was impeached by the House. He was not able to pass any significant legislation except legislation that had more support from Republicans than Democrats, including welfare reform and NAFTA, which was the first major free trade legislation. So, with that background, in 2008, Barack Obama gets elected president and enters office in 2009. He's very strong in the Senate and the House. He has 59 senators, soon to be 60, which is a magic number in the Senate. It's what is called a filibuster-proof majority. It means if the Democrats hang together, they can defeat any filibuster and pass any legislation. In the House, he had 257 Democrats to 178 Republicans, the biggest Democratic majority in a quarter of a century. He faced the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, so his first legislation was a stimulus bill. But he decided to make health care, and that passed right away. He decided to make health care his second. This was a somewhat unusual choice given the history I just recounted, and I don't think it will surprise you to know that many on his senior staff, including some law professors from Harvard Law School, and other parts of Harvard University, strongly advised against this. They said this is politically dumb, politically costly, but he rejected that advice and went ahead. And he succeeded, as you know, with the Affordable Care Act, but not without difficulty. I won't go through the entire history, but it's worth it to recall a little bit about how we got this law. He started out determined to have a bipartisan bill, a bill that had Democratic and Republican support. Even though he technically didn't need the Republicans, he had the majorities in the House and the Senate that he needed. But he spent months and months. It was in the Senate, and there was a group of Democratic and Republican senators that tried to come to some agreement, and they just didn't get there. I won't speculate on the reasons. And so he moved on. And the first thing he did is he made a deal with every interest group that had opposed Clinton. He made a deal with the drug companies, a deal with the hospitals, a deal with the insurance companies. And then the House passed a bill which was considered to be a very strong piece of legislation, fairly generous in terms of benefits, and so on. And the action moved to the Senate. And the Senate considered a really much less favorable bill. And parts of it kind of rushed together. But after the usual hours of debate, on Christmas Eve, the Senate passed national health care. And so the path seemed clear. You have a different bill in the House and the Senate. The process is you go to conference. Each body appoints conferees. They negotiate. They find something in the middle. They get the exact language, the same conference report, goes back to each body, it's passed, and goes to the president. Because in order for the president to sign the legislation, obviously it has to be identical in the House and the Senate. But then the trouble began. Because in January 19th, 2010, there was a special Senate election. Remember, Senator Kennedy had died, and so there was going to be an election in January. Everybody assumed this was not a problem for the Democrats. Of course the Democratic candidate would win this election. It was such a no-brainer that nobody paid attention. There are staff in the White House whose total job is to watch politics. That's all they're supposed to do. But they didn't watch this one. The Democrats didn't even bother to take a poll. They were so confident. And sure enough, they were wrong. Scott Brown won. The Democrats lost their filibuster-proof majority. It meant they couldn't get the conference report through the Senate. And so what are they supposed to do? The president was in a pretty tough position. He'd had another devastating loss. As you can imagine, his cautious advisors said, don't do it. You're not going to get this through. It's not worth the risk. His chief of staff famously said, just pass something little and claim victory. Don't try to do this. I don't know what his thinking was, but I imagine he realized this was the last chance. Nobody was ever going to try this again. And he obviously thought it was very important. There's a famous quote from Lyndon Johnson where he's in the presidency and his cautious advisors tend to be cautious. Were advising him not to do civil rights legislation. And he looked at them and said, well, then what the hell's the presidency for? And I suspect President Obama had some of the same thinking that, what's it worth if you can't try to do something really important? And so the strategy that was devised, which worked, was to take the Senate bill. We knew we couldn't get it through the Senate again. Take it and pass it through the House. That's the other way you do legislation. You can get identical bill if you don't change a word. And it didn't matter whether there were words that were mistakes or words you'd like to change. You don't change a word, you pass it through the House. The president signs it. And then, through a device that's familiar to us today, because it's what the Republicans are using for repeal, through something called budget reconciliation, they're able to improve the bill in certain areas. Because if you have a bill that affects the budget, so for example, if you want to increase the tax credits or increase the Medicaid benefits, you can do that through budget reconciliation, and it only requires 50 votes in the Senate, which obviously the Democrats had. So they passed the bill through the House, did budget reconciliation, and lo and behold, we had the Affordable Care Act. Now, what is the Affordable Care Act? Well, Massachusetts ends up being very important in everything, doesn't it? It was modeled after Mass Health, the state health care bill that was adopted under Governor Mitt Romney in 2006. And that bill was based on ideas, I find this so interesting, developed by the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative organization. They're the ones that thought of the idea of the mandate. And the Republicans actually proposed something like this as an alternative to Clinton, and it was just roundly rejected by the Democrats as not going far enough. But that was sort of the structure of the Affordable Care Act. There are two main components. One is Medicaid expansion. That counts for half of the new health care, about 10 or 11 million people. And the other is the health care exchanges, where insurance is sold, and importantly, low-income people get tax credits. And that accounts for another 10 or so million people. And so you have 20 to 22 million people who get health care. And then there's the mandate, and that's the big controversy. And this is the piece that says to everybody, you have to buy health care. And if you don't, you pay a penalty, namely $695 or 2.5% of your income, whichever is more. So it's a serious penalty. Now, this is the most controversial part of the Affordable Care Act. And that raises the question of why is it so important? Why are the Democrats so insistent on having this mandate? And the answer is it's essential to the core provision of abolishing consideration of pre-existing conditions. The idea being, if you're going to tell the insurance companies you can't consider whether somebody's sick, you have to have universal coverage. You have to cover not just sick people, but healthy people. Because if you're not going to raise the price for people who are sick, and you don't have a penalty, then people will do what's very logical, which is they won't buy health insurance until they get sick, and then they'll buy it, pay no penalty or no extra price. So the insurance companies will only be selling insurance to people who are sick, and that will require unsustainable prices, or they just choose not to sell the insurance. So that's the Affordable Care Act. Now it was time to implement it. And it was a rough road every step of the way, but I'll talk about three of the hurdles that we faced. First one is, on the day of enactment, 13 state attorney generals, to be increased to 26, filed a legal challenge to the mandate, the controversial piece, and to the Medicaid provisions, arguing that these two provisions were unconstitutional. It's called NFIB versus Sebelius. And the argument on the mandate was it violated the Commerce Clause, that under a statute has to have some basis, some authority in the Constitution for its existence. And the Commerce Clause is used widely. It was used for civil rights legislation. It's used for food and drug legislation. And it was used here because, after all, health insurance is in commerce. It's one of the biggest pieces of commerce. But the argument was that under the Commerce Clause, you can't require somebody to buy something. You can't require them to buy broccoli, and you can't require them to buy health insurance. Nobody gave this argument much chance of success. I mean, when I say nobody, I mean law professors, academics, lawyers who follow Supreme Court law didn't think it had much of a chance. But it worked its way through the courts. The courts of appeals split. The case went to the Supreme Court. It was a big deal. Argument in the Supreme Court is usually an hour. This argument was scheduled over 3 days. There were 4 separate arguments, so we had eight moot courts at the Department of Justice. The way it was scheduled, the first day was a jurisdictional issue. The second day was 2 hours on the mandate. And the third day was the Medicaid issue and an issue about severability. If the statute falls, if the mandate falls, does the whole statute fall, or just that one piece? The big day, obviously, was the second day. And the atmosphere of the courtroom was quite interesting. There are various ways. This is the hottest ticket in town. There are various ways to get tickets to Supreme Court arguments. The Solicitor General has some. The parties have some. The White House has some. Congress has some. The justices have some. And so in the courtroom, you have milling around, mixing together, not just the Attorney General and the Secretary of HHS, but Congressman Ryan, Senator Baucus, the key members from the House and the Senate, all kind of milling around, a little bit nervous about what was about to happen. Interestingly, before the argument, Don Verrilli, the Solicitor General, came up just to say hello to Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of HHS. We were sort of sitting there, and after he leaves, she says to me, well, that was really a nice thing for him to do. And I said, well, you're his client. And she said, oh yeah, really? It just had not really occurred to her. But the argument didn't go so well. And it got just terrible reviews. The court was very, very skeptical. Don spent 10 minutes of his allotted time on the tax argument. And Jeffrey Toobin, a CNN commentator, ran out of the courtroom and said, "This is a train wreck for the government." And one of the dumbest things any lawyer has ever done is spend 10 minutes on the taxing argument. We waited and waited and waited for the result. And what I love about this case is it's the greatest example of the experts being wrong, which is always kind of sweet. I mean, just look at it. Initially, the experts said the administration would certainly win the Commerce Clause argument. We lost it, 5-4. The experts said, after the oral argument, we would certainly lose the case. We won it. The experts said we would lose the tax argument. It was frivolous. We won that 5-4. They said we would certainly win the Medicaid argument. The argument was it was coercive on the states, even though Medicaid is voluntary and even though the expansion was basically funded by the federal government. It was coercive to make the states expand. And the experts said, the courts never said anything like that as coercive. Well, we lost that argument too. Although the court said, kind of rewrote the statute and said the states could choose to expand. So, whereas the statute said to every state, you either have a Medicaid program that's expanded or not, now the states could keep their old Medicaid and choose to expand. 13 have and 19 haven't. I'll tell you, the atmosphere on the day of the decision was really interesting. Usually you don't know when a Supreme Court decision is going to come down. It could just come down any day. But the court always saves the most important case for the last day. And so when you're in June and you're sort of winding down, you know what cases there are. And you know, it's 5 more cases, 3 more cases. And then finally, it gets down to 1 more case. And the court says, actually tells you, Wednesday's going to be the last day. So we knew that on Wednesday, this decision was going to come down. And in my office, everybody gathered. And the question is sort of, how do you find out the result? Because it's announced in the court. And if you're not in the courtroom, you're not really hearing it. And the other way it's announced is as the author of the opinion here, the Chief Justice, is kind of describing it, the opinion's handed out to the press. And so they're running to read it and sort of to get it up. And so what we did is we watched something called SCOTUS-Blog, and we had a person from HHS. The SG has a little office in the court where there's a speaker so you can hear what's in the courtroom. And so we're watching those 2 things. And I said, as a rule, I had a TV in my office, I said, we're not watching CNN, we're not watching any TV. Because when Bush v. Gore came out, they got it wrong. They said Gore won initially. And I said, we're just not going to do that. So anyway, you know, the way the opinion was announced, the Chief Justice is reading it. It's a straight face. He goes through the Commerce Clause. He says, you lose. And he goes through the taxing argument. He says, we win. And meanwhile, SCOTUS-Blog, they actually read it carefully and they reported it correctly. So we all got the right decision and we all celebrated. But meanwhile, the president comes out of a meeting, walks by a TV, where CNN flashes that he's lost the case, goes into his office, and for 5 minutes, he thought he had lost the case because his White House counsel, Kathy Rumler, was not going to go in and tell him the result until she was like 100% sure. And so I felt very fortunate not to have watched any TV that day. But anyway, that was a successful outcome, if barely so. But then came the second challenge, King v. Burwell. And this had to do with a drafting problem, and who knows whether it would have been caught in conference. It's just hard to know. But the Affordable Care Act has 2 kinds of exchanges that sell insurance. And in the Senate bill, which was the bill that passed, the assumption was made that the states would want to have their own exchange. Every state would have an exchange. There was money, various generous grants to set it up, that they would have control, they could sell Medicaid on it, and so on. And so when they drafted the bill, they have all the rules for the state exchanges. And then they said, well, what if the state doesn't adopt an exchange? Well, then the federal government will have an exchange. It was just like a little provision without much to it. In fact, only 12 states had state exchanges. 38 had the federal exchange. So the federal exchanges end up being very, very important. And this was of no consequence. That you get tax credits on either one. It was all fine. Not a big deal until somebody bothered to read the statute. Because the statute said that the tax credits were available on an exchange established by a state. Nothing about the federal exchange, on an exchange established by a state. So they brought a challenge, and unlike NFIB, this seemed like a pretty hard case. It worked its way through the courts. The Fourth Circuit and D.C. Circuit split, goes to the Supreme Court, and Justice Roberts writes a 6-3 opinion, our way, a classic opinion on statutory construction, where he looks at other sections of the statute and he says, you know, despite what you might have thought on the first reading, these other sections make no sense if you say the tax credit is only available to the state. And so he interpreted the statute as the tax credit being available for both the states and federal government. You know, we all breathed a great sigh of relief. I mean, it was clear that this was what was intended by Congress. Nobody even thought of this issue until long after the bill passed. The Congressional Budget Office, which is going to become important in a minute, it's a nonpartisan organization whose job it is to figure out how much legislation costs, among other things, and what the effects of it are. They had, when they scored it as a tax credit for the federal and state exchange. So it was clearly the right result. If it had gone the other way, who knows? It might have cost the president his reelection. I think we felt that way at the time. I think the White House did. But fortunately, we'll never know. And then the third challenge came in the fall of 2013 after the president had been reelected. We're now ready to roll this all out. The new health care is supposed to come beginning January 14. There's a lot of hoopla. You know, the president is talking about it. You know, after all this work, it's finally going to happen. And I remember I went to my office that day. It was also, interestingly, the day of a government shutdown. The Congress has to fund the government every year, and October 1 is also the date of the new year. And the Republicans had a scheme where they said, we are not going to fund the government until you agree not to implement the Affordable Care Act. And so all these things kind of come together. I go in my office. There wasn't really a lot to do because most people weren't in work that day. And so I go on the website just to kind of see how it's going. I put my name in, and I get rejected. I put it in again. I get rejected. I said, well, I'll try my daughter's name. There was clearly something wrong. And I called somebody high up in the secretary's office and said, oh, no, it's all fine. And if there's anything, it's just something little. Well, it turned out the website was a disaster. And it was true of many of the state websites, too. And nobody could sign up for 2 months. And this was, you know, this was like one of the most unhappy times in government because we didn't know whether it could be fixed at all. But it went through a very, very difficult time. I think, you know, this contributed to the unpopularity. In the end, it got up. You had until the end of March to sign up. In the end, 8 million people signed up the first year. It exceeded all projections. And so in the end, it was a great success, but it was a great, great embarrassment for the secretary, for the president, and lots of material for congressional hearings. So we're all up and running. Things are really going pretty well. And you kind of know the next part of the story. President Trump wins a surprise election. He controls the House and the Senate. The Republicans have campaigned to repeal Obamacare for 7 years. The House has passed the repeal bill 60 times. 60 times they've voted to repeal it. The Senate has passed it once to be vetoed by Obama. So now it's just a matter of mechanics. We have a Republican president, a Republican House, a Republican Senate. We know how to do this through reconciliation because you just have to defund Medicare and defund the exchanges, which is just a budget bill. So you don't need 60 votes. You only need 50. it's just as simple as pie. And so March 6th of this month, the American Health Care Act is introduced. I think a lot of people thought this was kind of the end of the road. I mean, they thought it right after the Trump election. It's flying through the House. They don't bother to have any hearings. It goes through the markups in Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce. It's set for a vote today. Going through the Rules Committee and the Budget Committee. Key provisions are devastating. Cuts Medicaid by 25% and caps all Medicaid spending, caps Medicaid expansion, replaces the tax credits based on income with tax credits based on age. In the CBO report where they say 24 million people will lose their insurance as a result of this bill, that's more million than people that got insurance under the Affordable Care Act. It's kind of extraordinary. But they give probably an extreme example, but it makes the point that under this bill, a 64-year-old who bought insurance because of his income for $1,700 under the Affordable Care Act will have to pay $14,600. So this is a devastating piece of legislation. Before this, I knew when I came here, the only thing anybody really wanted to know is what's going to happen. So I polled, my friends who really follow this and know Congress, Republicans and Democrats. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? A lot of people said it's going to pass. I mean, even a lot of Democrats who like to be optimistic said it's going to pass. There's just no way to stop it. And the Republicans kind of felt the same way, in part because Trump has made this such a big deal that if it doesn't pass, their point was he probably wouldn't be able to hold the Republicans together to pass anything else. So this isn't, for him, I think, it's not just about the Affordable Care Act. It's really about his entire agenda. Well, as you know, the House pulled the vote in the House today. It's not rescheduled. They're not going to reschedule unless they have the votes. They have some problems with moderates, but the real problems are with the conservatives. And a couple of days ago, you probably read the president met with them and basically said, look, if you don't vote for this, I'm going to campaign against you. So I'll get conservative candidates to run against you. And interestingly, last night I read the Koch brothers, who are a conservative group funding conservatives throughout the country, said that, look, we are against this bill because it's not harsh enough. And if you vote against it, we will help fund your reelection. So going right against the president. It certainly looks like to get it through the House, they're going to have to move the bill even more toward the conservative way. Harsher Medicaid cuts, harsher tax credits. They'd like to have a provision that made it so you can buy very thin health care plans, but that's got its own problem. But the problem with doing that, it might get it through the House, but it's going to just make it that much harder in the Senate. In the Senate, you've got 20 Republican senators in states that have expanded Medicaid. There are 10 Republican governors in states that have expanded Medicaid. The margin is thin. There are only 52 Republicans, so they can only afford to lose 3. There are 10 who I think are serious problems, 8 or 10, 2 of them on the conservative side, but the rest are moderates. So I don't know. I go back and forth day by day, but I'm feeling pretty optimistic today. I think this is probably going to work. The one thing I'll conclude with is the politics here for the president and for the Congress are very, very tricky. I mean, if you look at it, he chose to make this like his number one thing. It was his first executive order. It's his number one priority, so it's front and center. And yet repeal of health care is going to anger voters who are going to lose their health care. If he doesn't repeal it, it's going to anger the conservatives who are counting on repeal of health care. The ones who are listening to the Republicans campaigning for 7 years on repealing the Affordable Care Act. So while we can't know the outcome, I think we can be pretty confident that President Trump's going to regret making the repeal of the Affordable Care Act his signature initiative. Thanks.
So I saw three sort of general themes, and I had sort of two questions about each of them. The first general theme being about how divisive healthcare is. Second theme about how difficult the implementation was, the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
And then lastly, sort of a theme of what's going to happen next,
Right.
what's going on in current legislation.
Past, present, and future.
Yeah. Well, there were two questions about the past. Anyway, but first, just on just general divisiveness. I thought you put it well that, I think the Democrats think it's a great thing because it's expanding access. The Republicans object because they're being forced to purchase something they don't want to buy. But I wonder whether there's something to both sides. That is, it seems like having equal full access to efficient healthcare is clearly good. On the other hand, being forced to buy something that's inefficient seems painful. So was it a mistake not to first try to have regulatory changes that would make healthcare more efficient than it is before trying to make it something that everybody has to buy?
Well, I don't know quite how we would have done that because insurance is largely regulated by the states. So I think you would need legislation initially to get the government involved in it. I mean, also the politics, I think, of it were, President gets, in the first year or so, has a lot of momentum, and that's the opportunity to do something big. I think after that, it's very, very hard. So I think if he had waited, it just would have never happened.
Yeah. So you need legislation, but I guess I wonder whether the legislation should have been about the Healthcare Efficiency Act, something to
Yeah, but what
some
is
sort of reasonable cost-benefit trade-offs before.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, the focus is on the individual market. If you imagine somebody who works for themselves or has a very small business and they want to buy health insurance, and the problem is it was either extremely expensive or you couldn't get it. And if you bought it and you got sick, then you risk losing it. And so, if you say, well, the key answer, the key inefficiency was pre-existing conditions, that then leads you to the point where you have to have some system that is all-inclusive. You have to figure out a way of getting the healthy people in. And one of the big problems we've had with the Affordable Care Act is we haven't been successful in attracting enough young, healthy people. And so one of the reasons that healthcare is expensive today is because we haven't been successful. Maybe the mandate's not big enough, or maybe we just haven't done a good enough job, or maybe we just haven't allowed it enough time.
All right. Well, actually neatly brings us to my second question about divisiveness, which is the one thing we don't seem that divisive about is Medicare. Democrats love Medicare. Trump loves Medicare. Was there ever any thought given to simply expanding Medicare? You could have a statute that says we'll make it up to age 50, and every year after that we'll go earlier to sort of to go in the future so we could fund it. Why not start with something that people all seem to like and just use that as a political vehicle? I
mean, I think that's a great idea. You're right, people are generally pretty happy with Medicare. I think a lot of people who look at this would say, why don't we have a single payer system? Why do we need insurance companies? We should just have the federal government do it. But I think it was felt that was just a non-starter. I mean, for one thing, the insurance companies would oppose it in every possible way. And they had been so effective in blocking Clinton. And I think in some of the early proposals, that part of them did sort of slightly expand Medicare, but it was just seen as incredibly controversial, as logical and as much sense as that makes.
Yeah. So actually, just to jump to now with that, your point about insurance companies made me wonder, why they don't seem to be as influential right now in the political debate. It seems like Trump Care has been opposed by the insurance companies, the hospitals, the medical associations. And I think you're right that it seems like it's very iffy whether it'll get enacted, but not because of their opposition, really. It's more because of internal divisions in the House or among Republicans in the Senate. Why isn't just the mere fact that the medical industry and insurers seem to be against it make it a non-starter now the way it was back both in the Clinton administration and in the Obama administration?
I mean, I feel like Trump has broken all rules. I mean, all the things you used to assume just no longer apply. And, you know, he has, I mean, how did he get elected? How did he win the primaries? You know, he's done away with Romney, Giuliani, Hillary Clinton. I mean, and somehow, you know, at this moment in time, those kinds of constituencies do not have the clout that they once did on Capitol Hill. Now, I wouldn't underestimate them. You know, if this really got to the Senate, I'm not so sure that they wouldn't have a lot of influence. I mean, the individual market, it's not all insurance. It's a piece of what they're doing, and they have the ability to get out. So, you know, you wonder how much the insurance companies really care. I mean, they're not happy with this, but the biggest companies aren't even on the exchanges anymore.
Okay, so then I want to move on to the topic of implementation and the obstacles you faced. And there I had two questions. One seemed like you know, just a red cape to the bull was the mandate. Just got the conservatives very exercised. President Obama was against it in the campaign as well because he thought it was a political target. And bad for that reason that people would, not only for that reason, I think, but sort of philosophically, he was opposed to forcing people to purchase something. Now, as you say, it's a good vehicle to try to fix the adverse selection problem if you're going to have community rating. But was any serious thought given instead to just increasing the subsidy? I mean, after all, the tax subsidy we now have is enough that the employer markets don't collapse. So why not pursue the possibility of just more carrots rather than carrots and stick? You could not have the mandate, but have you know, an equal and opposite subsidy instead. That would have been more politically palatable.
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. I really don't know. I think they felt, since the mandate was a Heritage Foundation Republican idea, I think they really underestimated how divisive it was going to be. And I mean, you have to go back and look at the congressional debates, but I don't think that was the biggest issue until the bill passed. And so I think you know, everybody probably underestimated that. You know, and I mean, the other thing I think yours is a great idea, but you have to come up with the money, and that's hard.
Let's open it with a tax scoring thing, because in terms of the politics of it, I mean, the one thing that was striking to me is it was about the only major difference between Obama and Hillary Clinton in the primaries was that he was against the mandate, and she was for it.
Yeah.
And for that to be the
thing that
brought down the act seemed quite surprising.
I mean, I mean, politically, you know, in terms of the Supreme Court case, if they had just called the mandate a tax, it would have been a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Nobody had any doubt that you could call, but they were politically so afraid of calling it a tax because, you know, that was such a problem. But I mean, I don't know how much more you would have had to increase the subsidies. I mean, I think it's an idea. You'd increase them enough that then the young people would come in. They wouldn't have to pay much.
So what I was wondering, is it a budget scoring thing that it would have to?
Well, then you have to, I mean, the idea is, and Obama was really strict about this, is you have to pay for this bill. So if it costs $1 trillion for Medicaid and for the subsidies, then you have to come up with $1 trillion. It ended up being about $900 million or something. And so half of that is taxes, and they actually did half of that with Medicaid cuts, you know, cutting what hospitals make and so on. But I think you would have to have had more taxes. And
Right, so
They didn't-
mandates don't count as a tax, I guess, so you would have to,
Well, they counted, you would count the revenue from the mandate.
right, the revenue, but
Does
in terms
count.
of the cost on people for,
Yeah.
it doesn't count as a tax.
No, it's just revenue.
Okay. The other implementation question I had was, why did it take so long for the act to go from enactment to this 2014 implementation? So it got enacted, what, in 2009, I think?
Yeah, 2010.
Early?
2010,
2010?
yeah.
Okay. But 4 years, and I understand it takes a long time, but on the other hand, it seems like the longer you take, the more people have time to have lawsuits that interrupt things and potentially disrupt it. And, you know, right now, even in politics, had it been in place for 2 more years, it would seem even more of a vested right, even more difficult to take away. Why did it take 4 years to implement?
So Don Berwick sitting over here, he ran CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare, and he's thinking exactly what I'm thinking, which is this was incredibly fast. I mean, when you think of the size of this program and the number of things that had to be done, and the number of regulations that have to be issued, and you say, well, why don't you just write a regulation and issue it? But you have to write a proposal and get comments and respond to all the comments. I have to say, I've been in different government positions. I have never seen complex regulations go this quickly, anywhere near it, in any government program.
So is that just
so-
modern times? Because it just seemed to me Medicare was much faster to implement, and Social Security was much faster, which both in some ways were even bigger projects.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to want to go back and look. I think they may have been less complicated programs, though.
Okay. So I guess on what's going on currently, I had 2 questions. One was, I guess, the legal issue about budget reconciliation and whether you could, clarify that for us.
Sure.
Because what I'm wondering, there's all these regulatory changes that the Freedom Caucus is demanding, and they've already gotten not only the budgetary ones, but they're going to. Trump has already offered them, I gather, according to Politico, removal of certain essential health benefits like emergency services, maternal services, and mental health services. But they want even more regulations changed. But I wonder, why won't that mean that you can't go through budget reconciliation anymore? Because you have regulatory changes, not just budgetary changes. These are regulations affecting private insurers. Would you predict that they're going to have to go through a filibuster-proof 60-vote process if they have these regulatory changes?
So, I mean, this is the right question. The general rule is if it doesn't affect the budget, you can't do it through reconciliation, something called the Byrd Rule. But the critical thing to know is, so who decides? It's the Senate parliamentarian who essentially works for the majority party. So whatever we say here the rules are and how they have been is not necessarily what's going to happen. I mean, it is possible the parliamentarian will have some bizarre ruling, but I think you're right. So one of the things about the Affordable Care Act is it said this has to be real insurance. It used to be you could sell an insurance policy, for example, that would cover doctor's expenses, but not hospital expenses. And people bought it, and they were often very happy because every time they went to the doctor, their insurance paid for it. And as long as they didn't get really sick, they didn't really think about the fact that it didn't cover hospital services. And so one of the things the Affordable Care Act says you have to have these 10 essential health benefits: doctor services, hospital services, mental health care, and so on. And that's one of the things that makes the insurance fairly expensive. And so the conservatives in the House, what they would like to do is give the companies the ability to sell these very skinny plans. That would bring the rates down. And so that they could say they'd brought rates down even though the insurance would be so bad. And I think the prevailing thinking in the House and the Senate is that kind of provision could not go through budget reconciliation. So they could pass it in the House, and then when they got to the Senate, they'd probably have to pass a bill without it. And they'd also have to pass a bill maybe without the same Medicaid cuts in order to get it through the moderates. And so you'd have two very different bills, and then the question is what happens, because if the Freedom Caucus and the conservatives in the House feel like it's too much, it can't pass the House, and if the moderates in the Senate feel like it's too little, it can't pass the Senate. So,
Okay. Let's bring to the last question. I don't know whether being in D.C. and involved, you have any insight into this in particular, but I'm having a hard time figuring out what the Freedom Caucus's strategic motivation is. So I understand they want to narrow the act, but it seems awfully clear that it's never going to get enacted what they want. And why don't they think half a loaf is better than none?
So I was walking over with somebody, we were talking about this. I mean, it's like the people who are for single payer. They say, look, and maybe they're right, I don't know, the only kind of health care that's really going to work is single payer. And so we're going to vote against the Affordable Care Act because it's really not the right kind of health care. And I think they're the same way. They're like, we are against this, and we want to wait till we can kill it. And I think you're right. This may be their chance to do as much as they can, but that's not the way. And I'll tell you the other thing too. I think they're afraid about primary elections. In other words, they have been promising to do this, to repeal it. They didn't promise to change it or to cut it back. They promised to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Trump got elected. They got the majority. And I think there is some concern if they vote for this bill, the American Health Care Act or whatever it's called, they will get a primary challenge on the right, and with maybe the president campaigning against them like he has promised. And so I think that's, I think there's some of that too, but I don't have a great, that doesn't make sense to me. Why are you in politics if you don't want to accomplish anything? That's where it leads.
All right. Well, let's open up the floor to questions from the audience. And I guess we have the central mic everybody's using, I think.
I have two questions. First, is there any rational basis to not have single payer? The insurance companies don't want it because they're going to lose money, but most people don't care about the insurance companies. And my second question is, wasn't there something about Donald Trump signing an executive order getting rid of the mandate?
On the first question, that really goes back to Einer's first question too. It's politics. If we were to start all over again, I think we would design a system that looks something like Medicare, which people are very happy with and which works pretty well. It's less expensive. Clinton really tried this. Clinton's plan really cut out the insurance companies to a large extent, but he couldn't pass it. So I agree. And
I personally think, not to say, but I think people didn't like Clinton because of the Monica Lewinsky thing, not because of his health care. But wasn't there something about the affordable? Wasn't there something about Clinton signing an executive order regarding the mandate? I thought I heard that.
You mean Obama? You mean Trump? No, Trump. Yeah. So he signed an executive order. He basically said to the agencies a number of things, but one of them is do whatever you can to sort of soften the effect of the mandate. But he didn't really repeal it. He couldn't.
Do you think that executive order has any real impact?
I don't think it has much. I'm not sure it was really intended to.
It's more symbolic.
I don't know. In theory, the IRS could not enforce it. There are things the IRS could do. I don't know whether they will or not.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill and Einer. I have two questions. One, it has to do with the failure in messaging. Why so many people in this country love the benefits of Obamacare, but not if you call it Obamacare.
Yeah.
And these polling numbers where, if you called it the Affordable Care Act versus Obamacare, people liked it or didn't like it, or people saying, it's because of Obamacare that my 26-year-old now has to come off my insurance, when obviously it was because of Obamacare that they were still on it in the first place. So I'm just wondering if you can comment a bit on that, and then afterwards I have a question about contraceptives coverage.
There's obviously even though President Obama got elected twice, there's obviously a lot of hostility to him. And so the Republicans were very successful at tying him to this legislation, even tying his name to it. I mean, there are polls that show, you poll people and they say, I hate federal government programs, but don't take away my Medicare.
Right.
I mean, it's a little bit of that, too.
There's just irrationality in the
But,
system.
Look, the Obama administration did not do a good job messaging. They didn't do a good job selling this, explaining it, separating it from the name Obamacare. And now that he's out of office, now the Democrats are calling it the Affordable Care Act. For the first time, there are more people in the polls who support it than oppose it. And that will just grow. I mean, I would say Social Security, I understand, was incredibly controversial when it was first passed. And now it's popular.
So on contraceptives coverage, in terms of the regulatory mandate to include it as one of the required preventative services without copays and deductibles, this is the sort of thing where I think it's appropriate for the government to accommodate conscience to the extent it can, which your agency did exactly. And then in the Hobby Lobby case, those accommodations were basically used against the government to say, well, look, here's your less restrictive alternative. You already did this. And so I was wondering sort of strategically whether the agency kind of stepped back and said, geez, we made a mistake even offering the accommodations we did, or what the sort of discussions and rationales were around that.
I mean, in any big piece of legislation, there are always things you didn't foresee, and this is one of them. One of the things this legislation does is there's certain services that you get for free. In other words, if you have the insurance, there are no copays if you get a breast cancer screening or if you get contraceptive coverage. And we had to issue regulations. This is one of the reasons it took 4 years. I mean, because it's not just writing the regulations and issuing them. You've got to get kind of agreement across the government. And there was tremendous discussion about, well, what do you do about churches that have church plans? Do they have to provide contraceptive services? What about Georgetown University? It turned out Georgetown University, before the Affordable Care Act, had a plan, insurance plan, that covered contraceptive services, but they didn't know it. So now they find out and they don't want to cover it. So how do you draw those lines? And it's really tricky. And so, as you say, we drew them so that, religious organizations, as defined, could sell health insurance without contraceptive coverage. And we sort of figured out a way that people could still get it through a separate program and so on. And when it went to the Supreme Court, the Hobby Lobby case, interestingly, another case decided on the last day of the Supreme Court term, deemed to be the most important part. And the issue there was, well, you gave this to churches, but we're actually a business, but we are a religious business, and we want it too. And one of the things that they argued under the applicable statute called the Religious Freedom Reformation Act, they said, look, you didn't choose sort of the most narrow way to do this. You showed there's a way to accommodate religious organizations because you did it for the churches, you have to do it for us. It's a 5-4 decision. It just shows how hard some of this is.
Does it actually cost more money to have contraceptive coverage or less money for the insurance company? Because if you have contraception, you don't have maternal services, you would think.
It costs less.
Yeah, it costs less.
So it actually costs less money for the insurance company, so you figure the insurance companies want it. So...
yeah, you would think businesses are not,
right.
They wouldn't be funding it, really. They're getting...
But there are, I mean, if you think of a Catholic church organization that's selling insurance, they don't want to cover it. So you have to somehow provide for that.
Yeah, it's just interesting because it's not really, in some sense, it's not really their money because, at least not going to this coverage, but okay.
Yeah, no,
So I've got 2 questions for you. The first is, imagine we're in the next election cycle, either the next House election cycle or the next presidential election cycle, and you are a Democrat who, like many like me, thought the Affordable Care Act was a great first step and there's plenty of work left to do. What will this period of time teach you about whether that's something you should say publicly, defend? Should you be running against the Affordable Care Act? Should you be quiet about it? Just to think about how the political dynamics of more health reform have evolved. Second question is about Neil. Well, that's why I'm giving you the second one, so you can think about the first one.
Really
That's the
good.
second one. It's about Neil Gorsuch and his.
You know, I once had a Supreme Court argument, and I got two questions at the same time, so I answered the easier one. Maybe I can do that, huh?
I'll give you the option of choosing which one you want to answer. Then.
Okay.
Neil Gorsuch is reputedly a Chevron foe. I'm not sure how deeply it goes.
Yeah.
But what if we have a court that turns even just slightly against Chevron? How do you think it changes what HHS's daily business is like and the ability to do its job?
Oh, gosh.
You should probably tell the non-legal part of the audience
Yeah.
what Chevron is.
Okay, so Chevron is a case that basically says when a court is looking at an interpretation of a statute that an agency has interpreted, it has to give a lot of deference to the agency. So if the statute could be read two ways and the agency reads it one way, it has to go that way. And in fact, in some formulations it says if the agency's interpretation is rational, then the court has to defer. Now, the interesting thing about Chevron is it was originally the defendant was Gorsuch. Neil Gorsuch's mother was the administrator of EPA, and she was the defendant in the Chevron case. And she was arguing for deference, and the National Resources Defense Council, an environmental group, was arguing against it. And at this point, I was a public interest lawyer. I was a public citizen litigation group. So when that decision came down, I hated it because it made it harder to overturn government decisions. And so if you're trying to challenge, it all depends on where you sit. If you're challenging a government decision, you really don't want the deference. Now, when I was at HHS, I got to really kind of understand the value of Chevron deference. But I don't know. I think it's a little overstated. The courts, even before Chevron, they're going to give a certain amount of deference to agencies. They're going to give some deference to scientific expertise. There are various kinds of deference before Chevron. On the other hand, the courts, including the Supreme Court, play a lot of games. I mean, they say they're applying Chevron, but the idea of Chevron is if the statute is clear, the court gets to play. If it's not, it's sort of for the agency. But they'll just stay in that range of where the court is clear. I mean, here's an example. In the second case I talked about, King v. Burwell, the case where they're interpreting what does exchange created by a state, established by a state mean? What does exchange established by a state mean? Well, you would think that that's probably not clearly encompassing an exchange established by the federal government. I mean, it's either clear that the government loses or it's somehow ambiguous, and Chevron applies. But Justice Roberts, he looked at this and he said, well, actually, this is such a big decision, Chevron's not going to apply here. And then he just applied statutory construction. So the court has already said for very big cases, Chevron doesn't apply. I think there'll be issues with this Supreme Court nominee. I'm not sure that's the biggest one.
And what about the other question about the politics of?
Well, I think you have to tell me how all this is going to come out. I mean, if the Republicans really do essentially repeal this, I think they're going to have a lot of problems in the elections. If they don't succeed, my prediction is it's going to take longer than it would have, but the other 18 states will ultimately expand Medicaid. Ultimately, this is going to be popular the way Medicare is. But I don't know how long that's going to take.
Time for one more? Yeah. Hello. My question is, Secretary Price has seemed very occupied in selling the American Health Care Act, but with the vote postponed and perhaps as the repeal moves and replace moves further into the future, what sorts of actions might he take as head of HHS that worry you the most or concern you the most?
Concerning what?
Concern you the most. that he might take
It concerns me
unilaterally?
the most? I don't want to think about it. I guess the thing that concerns me the most is the Medicaid program. Okay, this is the program for the poor. And there's a lot of built-in flexibility in that program where the states can come and say, we want to make this change. And that flexibility has been used to expand Medicaid to new populations. But it can be used, for example, a state can come in and say, I want to experiment with work requirements. I only want Medicaid to be available to people who work. Or I want to expand with bigger co-pays. I only want Medicaid to be available to people who have fairly big co-pays before they get medical care. That will really, both those requirements, I think, would really cut the program back in kind of a pernicious way. So if you ask me one, that's the one that concerns me the most. And I think they've indicated they've got their eye on that.
Thanks for the talk. Really quick question looking into the future. Based on your experience and where you think the legislation is headed now and also in future administrations, do you think there'll ever be a time where there'll be negotiation with Medicare and pricing and how to broaden access to some of the cost-prohibitive drugs coming to market?
That is a great question. So prescription drugs, I think, are now close to 25% of health costs. I mean, it's just vastly increasing. When I first started doing this sort of thing, a drug that cost $10,000 a year was supposed to be prohibitive. There are now drugs that cost $400,000 a year. There's recently, in the last few years, a drug approved for hepatitis B. It's a life-saving drug, $80,000 a year. And the problem is, as we increase the government's role in all this, and we have a rule right now that says the government has to buy a drug if it's available and it works, what's to keep a company from charging $1 million? I mean, there are really no limits. You know, if it's just through insurance, the insurance companies obviously don't have to cover a certain drug or this, that, and the other. And so when you look at it, the only real answer is some kind of cost control. But there's no appetite for that right now. The drug companies have been very, very successful in opposing it, despite the fact that every other developed country has some kind of cost control of prescription drugs. There's lots of work being done on this. And there's a lot you can do on drug prices that I think does have a chance. But it doesn't get at that really hard nut, the $80,000 hepatitis B drug. There's a lot of work done on it. I think in the end, the work that's done that says the cost actually has to justify the economic benefit of the drug, may have some traction. But I think we're a long way from solving.
In terms of the politics, what about President Trump's proposal to have Medicare negotiate prices on behalf of the government? Wouldn't that effectively impose a type of cost control? And if he's for it, couldn't you get enough Democrat votes?
I mean, that's a start. I mean, I think there are half a dozen things you could do that really help. That does help. But right now under Medicare, it says if the Medicare has to cover at least one version of every drug available. So the negotiation will help in some areas, but I don't think it helps in that case where there's only one drug. I mean, how do you negotiate?
Well, you'd have
You
to
could
change
say
that
you'd
statute
have to be
as well,
willing
yeah.
to say, well, we're not going to cover that drug. You'd have to have that kind of leverage. And I don't think he probably doesn't know enough to say it, but I don't think he's gone that far. I mean, all the proposals for negotiation just are negotiation. They don't abrogate the rule that says Medicare has to cover all drugs.
If you can't threaten to walk away, you can't really negotiate very effectively.
It's
right?
tough. Maybe he could do it, but I don't know how.
This question might seem a little strange, but I think Ron Paul came close to admitting this in the last time he ran for president in one of the debates. But when the Republicans take a principled free market approach, I'm wondering if behind the scenes you ever heard any of them admit or be willing to accept that a lot more people would die under their idea of health insurance as opposed to, say, the Affordable Care Act or single payer or something like that.
I never heard them say that.
Was that, was it ever a topic of discussion? Or, I mean, because it seems relatively obvious, but no one, it's not really discussed or brought up.
Well, I think it's implicit in a lot of discussions. I think, people try to be polite and not offensive. I mean, the only time I ever saw something like that said was John Dingell, who was the longtime chair of the House Commerce Committee in tobacco legislation. On the floor of the House, when the legislation was being debated that gave FDA authority over tobacco, one of the members of the House got up and talked about how he smoked and this, that, and the other, and Dingell got up and said, "You're going to die." But it's just not the language. I mean, you're right, but it's just not the language that these things are talked about.
Another question?
Hi, thanks for the talking. I'm asking you to talk a little about more about the consequence of these skinny plans that just cover medical appointments and don't go deeper in the treatments in hospitals and other kind of treatments, more expensive treatments.
I'm not sure.
What about
you
these
talked
skinny
about the
plans?
skinny plans.
Oh, skinny plans.
Yes, if
Oh.
you can go deeper in this argument against the skinny plans.
What about, what's the question? What?
I want to hear more about you.
Oh, hear more about
the consequence.
Oh, okay. Well, so it
of
used to
these
be
plans.
before the Affordable Care Act, the states regulated insurance, and there was really no requirement that the insurance company sell a certain kind of plan, which is fine as long as the consumer understands it, I suppose. So, you could buy a plan, for example, that had a very high deductible, or a plan that didn't cover certain kinds of services. And a lot of plans sold to college students were that way. And so the price was great, but the coverage wasn't. And part of the problem with that is when people don't have health insurance, what they do is they'll go to the emergency room of the hospital. And the hospitals, for various reasons, are required to treat them. And then the hospitals will raise their charges. So the calculation was, before the Affordable Care Act, everybody was buying insurance. $1,000 of that insurance policy went to treat people who are uninsured. And I think if you're going to have comprehensive sort of universal insurance, which you need to end pre-existing conditions, you need to have some minimal requirements as to what that is. And what the Affordable Care Act does is says, look across the employer plans. Most people have employer plans. Look what the states require for the employer plans and do that. It's not like something extra, but you have to have as much as the typical person would get if they had insurance through an employer.
So related to that, the reverse of the sort of skinny plan he's talking about, where you just cover sort of routine medical care, seem to be the sort of plans with very high deductible. There were a lot of those bronze plans under Obamacare. And I wonder whether, even those seem extremely rational, because you want to insure against big risks, did that unduly increase the political unpopularity? Because a lot of the objections you see politically to it is people say, I had to spend a lot of money for health insurance, and I keep having to fork out money for doctors anyway because of my deductible. So was it a bad political strategy?
Maybe.
Though it may have been a good economic strategy.
I think part of what happened is the companies, and some of this is the way the bill was written, some of the provisions, but they came in pretty low. And so they intentionally lost money in the early years. And there were some provisions to sort of make up for it, but they didn't work as well as everybody thought. But they also lost money in early years because they wanted to get people to sign up, because the way insurance works, you sign up, you're not likely to change. And so it was kind of natural there would be a year when rates would go up, which happened to be last year. And I'm not so sure that would have continued, but it really was a shocker to people. And I think some of the companies really underestimated what the risk pool was going to look like. I mean, I think that the biggest problem is there are not enough healthy people who are buying insurance.
So yeah, I'm from Switzerland. I was just, you see these studies where the U.S. healthcare system is pretty mediocre with regard to outcomes.
Yeah.
And they have, remarkably expensive. And it's not a question of just single payer versus freer market type systems. You have countries like Switzerland, Denmark, Singapore, which are also sort of free choice systems, which have about half the cost that the U.S. healthcare system has. So I'm just wondering if you could do, say, 5 things or 3 things, setting aside political resistance, to actually sort of recalibrate the balance between outcomes and costs.
Yeah.
What do you think would be most effective?
I think the most important thing is, to the extent you can, ending fee-for-service. So under our system, doctors, if there's an X-ray, there's a payment for that. If there's an exam, there's a payment for that. And so the economic incentive for the doctor is to have as many services as you can. And the answer to that is sort of bundled services, which we had made a lot of progress toward. And the idea was to do that for Medicare, but also work with the private insurance plans, so that would be a nationwide thing, because it's to their benefit too. And so if you're getting a hip transplant, there's one payment for that, and it covers the actual surgery, but it covers the preparation, it covers the doctor's visits, it covers the rehabilitation, and so on. But it's a single payment, and then you've got to have a system to make sure that corners aren't being cut. But that's the single most important thing, and we were really moving toward that. And unfortunately, the current administration put a halt to some of the most recent experiments on it.
The pricing mechanism, there is really no free market for healthcare. And if you think about a patient, they're usually in a very desperate state. It's you have an insurer, you have an insurer who's paying for the cost, and they're in no position to judge whether it's a cheap or effective service, et cetera. So you have this. It's very difficult to.
Yeah, I mean, Medicare does a pretty good job. I mean, I don't know how Medicare compares to other countries, but it might not be so bad.
Well, drug prices are twice the price in the United States.
Drug pricing is a huge problem.
But hip replacements as well. So it's,
yeah.
So do you think the bundled payments have been successful in, bending the cost curve, preventing costs from rising as much as they?
I mean, they certainly should be. I don't know whether there's been enough time to study them, but they absolutely have to be. Because you can see what the individual payments are, and the bundle payment is less. So.
And what about accountable care organizations? Do you think they've been successful with their incentivized cost reductions and actually reducing costs? Because I hear very mixed things.
Yeah, it's too bad, because Don Berwick, who is here, he's really the creator of them.
Well, we can speak freely now that he's not here.
I don't know. I don't know. And one big problem in the healthcare industry is the consolidation. And the accountable care organizations, waive certain antitrust restrictions and so on, and really sort of encourage that consolidation on the theory that there'll be real efficiencies. But I'm not sure which is won out. So I don't know the answer.
All right. Now, suppose it comes to pass that they don't repeal Obamacare, that this political stalemate continues. Could the House just refuse to appropriate money for the next round of of subsidies or for Medicaid expansion funding? Do they have to pass a new act, or could they just do it through appropriations, withholding appropriations?
That is a great question. I think it's a permanent appropriation. So I think they would affirmatively have to stop the appropriation. So there's some appropriations that are sort of year to year. Actually, I'm quite sure of it. So the tax credit appropriations are a permanent appropriation, and they don't have to be done every year. So you actually would have to have a law to turn it around, and the same thing is true of Medicaid.
Didn't the Congress during when Obama was president withhold funding for certain implementations of Obamacare?
They no. I mean, they can shut down the government. I mean, they can withhold funding for the whole government, or they can withhold funding for HHS. And I guess they could withhold funding for, they could try to withhold funding for a particular program.
Yeah, I think
But
it's
it would-
the insurer one. I think the ones to recalibrate for insurers who took sicker patients on. I think they cut that or something.
Yeah, they could do that, but that would have to go through the House and the Senate and be
Oh.
signed by the president. But
Okay.
the problem is, they really have to get the Senate to agree to it. And if it ends up sort of stalemating the whole HHS budget, that's not going to be acceptable. I mean, they can't, right? And so then there will be what they call a continuing resolution, which is there'll be sort of a month to month, but then all the programs kind of go on as they were. So I think there's something to what you're saying. There are probably ways they could do that, but it's not easy. And yeah, I don't know what they want to do. I mean, there's a lot. If the administration wants to gut things, there are all sorts of things they could do that would really make the exchanges unsuccessful. But then they own it, and I don't know that they want to pay the political price for that.
So you don't think they'll be successful in politically saying it was going to spiral, it was in a death spiral already, and they're not to blame for it? That seems to be the claim being made.
Yeah, I don't want to. I mean, look, Donald Trump has been successful in doing things that are unimaginable in terms of convincing the public. So I'm not going to speculate on I'm not going to say he couldn't pull that off.
Well, thank you very much. If there's no more questions, so